Okay. All right. As people join the webinar, I want to thank everybody for joining today. I want to especially thank our guest, Professor Sarah Dauncey, for joining us on what is her Friday evening in the UK. So thank you very much, Professor Dauncey, for joining. Thanks also to my co-hosts, Professors Jess Nairn, Jessica Luck, and Tiffany Jones, and thank you to Thin Lee for keeping us afloat with all matters tech related. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Dauncey. She's Professor of Chinese Society and Disability and in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Nottingham in the UK. She joined the School of Sociology and Social Policy in 2016, having previously served as Deputy Head and Director of Teaching at the School of Contemporary Chinese Studies. And prior to that, she was at the University of Sheffield, where she helped to establish the Chinese programs and served as Deputy Director of the Sheffield Confucius Institute. Before that, she was at the University of Durham, where she completed her PhD in late Ming fashion and women's culture. Outside of the university, she's a member of various journal editorial boards, and her research focuses on disability in China, in particular the way in which the changing Chinese socio-political environment has transformed the cultural encoding of disability from the end of the Cultural Revolution. We're going to share in the chat a few links to Professor Dauncey's faculty profile, also to her recent book with Cambridge University Press, Disability in China, Citizenship, Identity, and Culture. Professor Dauncey is also a senior fellow of Advanced HE and has received awards at both Sheffield and Nottingham for her excellence in teaching and leadership. And one thing I certainly share with Professor Dauncey is an enthusiasm for Chinese language education and the importance of that. I have a friend and neighbor here at UC Riverside, Perry Link, who came in a few weeks ago, and his point of access to the field was Chinese language studies and the importance of that. So this is at a really interesting nexus of Chinese studies and disability studies. So I'm really absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Dauncey. Please join me in giving her a virtual welcome, and thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And yes, it's Friday night here in the UK, but so I'm really pleased to be able to join you and share my Friday night with you. I hope I'm going to give you something to think about anyway this evening. Here, morning there. So I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay. Hopefully it will be okay. It'll probably mean that, am I sharing now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Right, I'll just start. Hopefully. Is that okay? Right, okay. So I thought I'd start this talk this evening by thinking about the ways in which emotions seem to be particularly attached to disability and disabled persons. And the image that I've started here with is taken from an art show held in Shanghai in the Pudong district a couple of years ago. And it was drawn in by a young disabled person who has a learning difference. And I was really struck by the way we have an image of two faces, and one of which seems to be crying. And I was it got me thinking about the ways in which people with learning impairments in particular are seen as problematic, because they're often seen as probably too emotional, not emotional in inverted commas the right way, or not emotional enough. So I was thinking how are disabled people expected to feel about themselves, their impairments, their lives in China, obviously, which is my focus of study, or anywhere else for that matter. And I thought I'd go, I sort of start by referring back to Professor Tom Shakespeare, who gave a talk for you a couple of weeks ago. He's a professor of disability studies, but he said in one of his articles, and I'm going to quote him now, "Have you ever thought to yourself, I'd rather be dead than disabled? It's not an unusual reflection. Disability in everyday thought is associated with failure, with dependency, and with not being able to do things. We feel sorry for disabled people because we imagine it must be miserable to be disabled," end quote. This fear or anxiety seems to follow disability wherever it goes. As a consequence, people who lose large areas of function through accident or illness are, suggest Marx, better off dead in inverted commas. And this fear of disability forms a major part of the emotional backcloth to the political, cultural, and personal consideration of things like assisted suicide, around which there are great debates currently. All of these negative emotions are then projected onto and often internalized by disabled people themselves. The pervasiveness of what is known as the medical model and its pathologization of disability has made it all too easy to assume that if disabled people appear sad, fearful, or lonely, then it's something intrinsic in them and their impairment, rather than something that is contingent features of their physical, social, or cultural environments. Entrenched ableism, or the ideology that being non-disabled or fully able is superior, makes it difficult for non-disabled people to accept that disabled people might express joy and satisfaction about their lives. Yet some surveys have revealed that disabled people report a surprisingly high quality of life, given those recognised and often considerable discrepancies in their social and material deprivation, social isolation, loneliness, lack of employment, and exposure to a range of potentially adverse life events, violence, discrimination, and other things that they face. Large differences in what some people might call objective welfare do not always make for a difference in those people's subjective happiness. This is what Albrecht and Divliga have described as the disability paradox. People who have what look like severe or even moderate physical or mental health problems often do not feel as unhappy as people without them would predict. In fact, some of them do not feel unhappy at all, they say. Those skeptical about the subjective nature of such quality of life data have described these self-reports in the terms of, in quote, happy slave, a phrase used in post-colonial interrogations of the ways in which white masters justified their use and abuse of Black bodies. In Marxist terminology, this is known as false consciousness. In other words, people think that they are happy because they do not know any better, or they are misled by material or ideological and institutional processes into thinking that they must be satisfied with their lot. These cheerful disabled people must be, these proponents argue, in some form of denial. I'm just going to forward on the slide there. So here is a picture of those happy disabled people from that who contributed to that art exhibition in Shanghai those 2 years ago. And it's quite interesting. Again, it's one of those things, we have these happy disabled children. They all look like they've had a great time. I translated the love is more Aida Bouton into a slightly different sort of love differently or love different. So there's something going on here about that disabled persons are expected to be loved differently, or we have to love them because they're different. That's a whole sense of that going on. I'm going to start then by going specifically to China and, thinking about then how, what is the relationship between disability, sense of belonging and citizenship and emotions. What roles do emotions play in mobilizing the engagement of disabled people and non-disabled people into the values of citizenship? How do disabled people respond to these feelings and emotions and these narratives of belonging? And how do these prevalent emotions towards people with impairments and the disablement of such people work? How might a better understanding of all these things contribute to development of a society that really sees disabled people as full equals and enables them to play as full a role as possible in all areas of our collective lives? Well, in the Chinese case, I'm going to start with some words of Hui Liangyu, who at the time of writing in 2013 was the Chinese Vice Premier and chair of the State Working Council on Disability. He published an essay online entitled My Affection for Disabled People. It's sort of my positive feelings for disabled people. And in it, he pays attention to the ways in which his awareness of disabled people has increased through his encounters with them. I'm not going to read it out, but throughout the speech, there are words of love, care, bravery, pride, misfortune, pleasure, happiness, simple feelings, sincerity, kindness, gratitude, all of these things sort of in this very short quote are quite obvious there. Hui Lianyu's views, to me, appear to encapsulate current Chinese state thinking on what I've described makes an ideal, in inverted commas, disabled citizen. Disabled people are to be valued if they make some form of contribution to society. This helps them to pay back any support or care from which they might have benefited. They have certainly suffered misfortune, but with suitable effort on their part, can find pride, pleasure, happiness even in their lives. Those who exemplify selflessness provide a model of behaviour for everyone else, disabled and non-disabled alike. Those who exemplify selflessness provide a model, those who are uncomplaining about their situation should receive the gratitude of society. Yet, while his essay focuses on the responsibilities that engender the right to belong as a valued person in China, what is noticeable is its emotionality. Non-disabled people are expected to feel something about disabled people. Disabled people are presented as emotional themselves, and disability itself is clearly something to be emotional about in China. Of course, Hui's essay presents a particular vision of disability that is both embraced and contested in China today. Citizenship for disabled people in China is as complicated and as culturally situated as anywhere else. In my attempt to map out the cultural spaces, including film and literature, in which those meanings had been created, negotiated, and challenged since the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, it soon became clear that those existing theories of citizenship and the place of disabled people within them neither reflected the dynamism of state conceptions of who belonged, nor in the ways in which disabled people experiences those forced and negotiated their own place in society. And all of these ideas I developed in my book, which was published by Cambridge University Press, and on the screen there. So I felt that was a problem. The terms often used to describe disabled people's difficult relationship, I'll just put it down, with citizenship elsewhere, and we have shadow citizens, invisible citizens, absent citizens, felt like very static and negative descriptions that denied any sense of agency or potential inclusion. And what I'd found in my research is that there was a wide and ever-moving spectrum, one in which disabled people could be marginalised, denied rights, feared, not even regarded as human at the one end, but be treated and apparently feel like full and valued members of their communities at the other. And so I came up with the term para-citizen, and by extension, the concept para-citizenship. I felt this encapsulated this tension much better, and it seemed to reflect the various power differentials and contested meanings around belonging and identity that disabled people were experiencing in China, and around which their lives were framed and shaped. What is more, I felt that there was less judgment in the term para-citizenship. It couldn't necessarily be dismissed as some form of false consciousness just because we couldn't understand why some people might feel pride, for example, in parasporting abilities. So what I realise now is that rather than being an expression of para-citizenship and the relationship a para-citizen could have with their respective communities, emotions were actually playing a much more crucial role than that. They seem to be a crucial and integral dimension of para-citizenship, the way it is created, negotiated, and sometimes contested. Citizenship has generally been understood as both a legal status that bestows rights, as well as a social contract between state and citizens that involves the exchange of rights and responsibilities. And as all of these works that I've put on the screen here have shown, it is also well recognised that disability in the form of both physical and mental impairment disrupt notions of what might be termed the ideal citizen, and that disabled people globally are denied a whole range of rights in various ways and to various degrees because of their impairments. I'd particularly point people to have a look at Mary Sepulchre's book, Disability and Citizenship Studies, down there on the left-hand side of the screen, because I think it has a wonderful discussion of the ways in which disabled persons' rights have been denied in all sorts of areas of citizenship. Regardless of geography, history, culture, bodily and mental difference has offered innumerable challenges to how we understand personhood. What makes a life valuable to the family, community, nation, or beyond? And what makes a life worth living to the individual concerned? Invariably, citizenship has worked to define the values and norms of who belongs in a particular polity or community in relation to a vision of perfection that few of us can expect to meet for the entirety of our lives. Physical impairment may see us excluded from all or some forms of work and prevent us from accessing aspects of social and cultural life. Cognitive impairment might see us excluded from political participation because we're assumed to lack mental capacity. It might see us removed from society altogether through institutionalization. Learning differences might see us denied an education or placed in segregated learning that limits our potential. Due to any or all of the above, we might be legally prevented from forming personal relationships, having children, or meeting markers considered important in our communities. Not being able to do these things or having them take away from us is something that drives both individual and collective fear of disability. As societies around the world have grappled with questions of disability and citizenship, one of the most important global initiatives has been the development of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UNCRPD. Since coming into force in 2008, the UNCRPD has provided a much-needed reset to international values relating to personhood and citizenship. Its articulation of a wide-ranging set of rights for disabled people has seen them transformed from the object of laws, policies, initiatives designed to make them more citizen-like, to subjects with their own rights who can live with dignity, free from discrimination, and flourish, regardless of their distance from traditionally assumed able-bodied and minded norms. Both building on and complementary to the social model of disability, the UNCRPD sets out a vision what an inclusive society could look like and what kinds of steps might be taken to ensure that all barriers to full personhood and citizenship are reduced and eliminated. What is interesting, though, is that it's while it's going to be described as very positive and aspirational, it is not inherently, or more importantly, explicitly an emotional instrument. Its focus is firmly on setting out the new international norms and values that focus on rights, respect, dignity, equality of opportunity. There is no mention at all about how disabled people or non-disabled people should feel about disability or impairment. That is not to exclude the possibility that it might engender particular feelings about it or emotions on reading it or benefiting from it. Signatory states, as one would have imagined, have engaged to a greater or lesser extent with this roadmap. And this has been dependent upon a wide range of factors, such as political will, socio-economic development, and resistance from competing local and global norms and values. As such, the inclusive vision set out by these states differ greatly and establish varying landscapes against which disabled people must imagine what it means for them personally and collectively. The Chinese state has certainly been very busy thinking about disability and citizenship. Its own solutions have been informed by a cocktail of pre-existing norms and values from Confucian patriarchy and familialism, colonial and socialist discourses of biomedicine, the imperatives of communist revolution, and more recently, economic development, all of which have worked to prioritize the healthy body and mind. The past 100 years or so of Chinese modern history has seen the norms of para-citizen shift, such that as the useless people, the feiren of traditional times, have been transformed into the useful people, the you-yong-de-ren of today. And that's part of the history, is what I've covered in my book I just showed you. The body responsible for setting out and implementing this vision is the China Disabled Persons Federation, or CDPF. Its current chair, Zhang Haidi, shown on the slide here, is a wheelchair user herself and possibly China's most well-known and influential disabled person. Here she describes its relationship with disabled persons. Essentially, it's what has been described as a paternalistic bio-bureaucracy by Matthew Corman, a form of neoliberal disability governmentality. The CDPF provides, coordinates, and supervises services for disabled persons. It also sets out a view of how disabled people should be viewed and treated. Yet it goes further than the UNCRPD as it guides disabled people as to the correct way they should behave and feel about their disability themselves. As Article 3 on the Law of the Protection of Disabled Persons of 1990, revised post-UNCRPD in 2008, goes, persons with disabilities shall enjoy equal rights and they should be protected by law. So this is obviously very much influenced by the UNCRP there. But underpinning this is still a very much a historic medical model understanding of disability. Here we have a definition that suggests that a person with disabilities refers to one who has abnormalities of loss of a certain function. They can't perform or they have lost the ability to perform in an activity in the way considered, and they use the term normal, 正常. So the Chinese definition of disability focuses on abnormality, which has the effect of othering the disabled mind and body. Not only does it create a fear of impairment and of disabled people themselves, this othering creates a strong impetus for disabled people, their families, and broader society to actively seek remedy for their condition through prevention, cure, or rehabilitation for who could possibly aspire to be, in inverted commas, abnormal. However, what moves Chinese legislation even further away from the human rights-based principles of the UNCRPD are the unique responsibilities thrust upon disabled people. I use the word unique here in the sense that they are culturally Chinese and seemingly peculiarly applicable to disabled people in a legislative sense, as well as in the sense that, to my knowledge, no other state has stipulated such responsibilities so explicitly in its legislation. Article 10 suggests that disabled persons should display an optimistic and enterprising spirit, have a sense of self-respect, self-confidence, self-improvement, and self-reliance, and make contributions to socialist construction. Successfully performing para-citizenship comes with clear duties, it seems. And not only have these duties been embedded in all forms of CDPF communications and propaganda since the early 1990s, they have also become embedded and reflected in popular culture, films, documentaries, novels, memoirs, produced for and by disabled people themselves. The rise of the internet and its reach in China has offered even more opportunities for the state to control and modify disabled people's lives in line with these self as enterprise discourses, as other scholars such as Lin and Yang have also shown. So these four selves, as we really need to term them, self-respect, self-confidence, self-improvement, and self-reliance, can be seen everywhere, as I've suggested. Here in a special school, it's written across the top of the blackboard there. Here in the school motto, it's a vocational college for people with learning impairments, and it's suggesting that in order to be a member of society, you have to embrace the spirits of an able-bodied person. You have to be self-respecting, you have to have self-belief, you have to self-improve constantly. So be like an able-bodied person, as I've put on the slide there. Even the Chinese dream, Xi Jinping's sort of major sort of underpinning philosophy that has guided his tenure since 2012, 2013. Disabled persons are encouraged to self-improve to achieve their own Chinese dream, or achieve the Chinese dream on behalf of the nation themselves. And so all of these ideas have sort of come into what's known as what I feel can be described as China's ideal para-citizen. So disabled persons should aspire to be the same as normal, in inverted commas, or able-bodied people. They do this through cure and rehabilitation. And they channel these sort of emotion-driven qualities of self-belief, self-respect, and a sort of self-improvement, and being a sort of able to live on one's own and independent. This means that they can fend for themselves and earn a living, very important in a neoliberal society. They can integrate into society. I have no idea where they've been all this time, but apparently this is the term that's used in all these documents. And by doing so and becoming a sort of a very useful person, they can start to work to repay society, as I said earlier, for all of this help and benefit that they've received. And by doing so, they would have a life worth living. So disabled people in China are therefore presented as welfare subjects and as such in need of pity and support. They can ideally divest themselves of the fearful abnormalities that keep them at a distance from normal society. Yet they are also paradoxically the neoliberal agents of their own destinies. And as such, they are expected to repay the care they have received from the state and society through their hard work and gratitude. So through such legislation, the Chinese state presents what it imagines its inclusive society might look like and how we might get there. But also, this narrative frames that vision in explicitly emotional terms and effective ways. So we get to begin to get a sense of what such a society might feel like. Equally importantly, to signpost that the expected emotional response of those who are required to navigate this route to para-citizenship, either as disabled people themselves or as their friends and families and allies, is all clearly laid out for us there. So emotions then appear to be central to the ways in which the Chinese state talks about para-citizenship, and they do so in two distinct but overlapping ways. The ways in which disabled people are expected to feel about themselves, and the ways in which non-disabled people, and by extension institutions, nations, etc., feel about them too. Psychologists have long argued about how many emotions we have and when and how they work. And Ekman, sort of famous psychologist, suggests that we should be attentive to around 15 emotions that are quite distinguishable from another and from other affective states and moods such as romantic love, grief, jealousy, and other states such as interest. But what has more consensus is that although emotions might be intrinsically biological, they are also socially constructed. And as Martha Nussbaum has suggested, our understanding of what constitutes emotions, how we express them, who we can express them, when we can express them, and about what we can express emotions is all heavily dependent upon our language and culture. Even when we use technically the same classifications and words, and I've deliberately put the Chinese version of the words here against the English terms too, they may be understood in vastly different ways because of those differences in language, religion, etc. So what we have to be really careful about is ensure that any exploration of emotions has to acknowledge the fact that research of one particular socio-cultural context will have its own peculiarities. And all of this really makes it quite difficult to attempt to synthesize ideas around emotions, around a framework of citizenship, and in this case, para-citizenship. Research into disability, regardless of context, is ripe with expressions in the language and motion. And a lot of this, no doubt, sort of reflects the fact that the intrinsically somatic or bodily nature that is disability. But as I've started to suggest in the Chinese case, ableism and neoliberal ableism in particular play a role in framing and shaping the cultural politics of emotion and affect. Under neoliberal ableism, Dan Goodley, a British critical disability studies scholar here in the UK, argues that the cultural logics of autonomy, self-sufficiency and independence become linked to psychological contentment and the affect of, and he says particularly happiness. And I'm quoting him here. The individual citizen is continually pushed to the end point of supposed contentment through the never-ending performances of labour and consumption. Happiness is to be bought, he says, and so is able-bodied and able-mindedness. And so what we have is, I suppose, a sense of Laurent Bellant's cruel optimism, the mistaken belief that happiness and success is attainable if you work, consume, or do anything hard enough for it. In other words, I think this starts to help us explain this essential, I suppose, Foucauldian dilemma of why would we invest ourselves emotionally in the cultures, institutions and practices that seek to discipline us and constrain us and limit us and often make us feel bad about ourselves. Well, that's certainly the case in China. And that disabled people are inherently unfortunate or have suffered some form of misfortune or 不幸 appears to be the very starting point for this investment in China. Not only are disabled people presented themselves as being unhappy, distraught even about their situation as disabled people by the state, by the media, their unhappiness is designed to elicit feelings of anything from pity to love in those around them. It is perhaps not accidental that the term now used for charitable or humanitarian activities in China can be translated literally as loving heart or compassionate activities, 爱心活动. And extended narratives of disabled suffering and non-disabled compassion can be found across the internet. And what I have shown on the slide here is just one example. It comes from a Buddhist philanthropic charity, the Clearwater Charity. And they do a lot of work supporting what they describe as vulnerable people, or 弱势群体. And the misery of living with disability literally frames this photo story from the start. And it commences with this quote: "The disabled are just the unfortunate among all living beings. They should not be underestimated or neglected or even shunned. The disability is not their fault, but they have to bear the pain." And this particular story tells us about a mute couple, Uncle Deng and Auntie Bai, both of whom are unable to speak, essentially. And I'm just going to just give you a little flavor of how their story is told. Not long after we entered the house, the story goes, Uncle Deng was crying with snot running from his nose and tears from his eyes. Volunteers hurried forward to help him wipe it off. But even though they wiped it for a long time, they couldn't clean it up because Uncle Dears had not stopped. His brain injury meant that he couldn't stop drooling. On the other side, his wife, Auntie Bai, was also crying. Because she couldn't speak, she babbled and gesticulated with her hands and feet. We understood that she was anxious because she had too much unspeakable pain in her heart. While the reporters attribute the emotional reactions of the couple in part to their impairments, what becomes painfully clear it is their poverty, lack of social welfare and isolation that is the primary cause of their distress. But such a message doesn't serve the purpose of the story, which whips up pity and compassion for these poor, unfortunate people and celebrates the care and compassion of the volunteers who step in to help them out of their misery. So how to move from this state of misfortune to one resembling a more, in inverted commas, normal life or even glory? Well, disabled people in China today can move and inspire non-disabled people too. China has a long history of exemplars and model citizens, and disabled people have been included in these from the 1950s onwards. In fact, Zhang Haidi, whom I showed you earlier as the former president of the CDPF, was one of those very model citizens as well in the early 1980s. And many of the disabled citizens are celebrated in these big sort of national awards, television shows. And one of them I want to talk about, and you can see on this poster here, this is celebrating the life of one particular person, Liu Hong, from Suzhou. He set up a business to support disabled people like himself, and here it talks about on the poster that he's used his very weak body to lift up dreams, and he's used his sort of strong backbone to carry out lots of work and responsibilities, and in doing so, he's become an inspirational model. There's even a television program called Inspire China where these people are celebrated, and Liu Hong had his own segment on this. In many respects, these award shows are not very very similar to award shows that are shown elsewhere around the world, and we have a lot here in the UK. I think what's slightly different is this is run by the China's CCTV, which is a state-run corporation. It's sort of and it's subject to its own sort of censorship, and it's sort of is there to portray the types of propaganda. For Liu Hong from Suzhou, his whole life has been built on self-improvement, that term I introduced earlier. He's first introduced by the studio host, and the studio host starts off by this, and I'm quoting: "When people suffer misfortune, we often say reassuring things like, when God closes one door, he opens a window. In real life, however, it is usually the case that it is the person themselves who is the one who must open that window. There is one young man, he cannot even walk properly. Yet, not only has he opened that window for himself, he has also helped lots of other people find that window too. And so, in a few minutes, we are left in no doubt about what to think about Lu Hong and his disability. It is a pitiful misfortune. More than that, he's cast off his own individual misfortune to rely upon his own efforts and endeavours. If you are like him, then you can do the same. And so we hear a lot about Lu Hong's story, and it's quite interesting that he explains how he didn't want to be a burden to his family. He couldn't get a job himself. He wanted to help others. And so I think the programs like this exploit common tropes about disability. The first of these is disabled people are not normal people. They belong to some other category of personhood. The second is the automatic assumption that they are somehow less efficient because they're disabled. The third is that disabled people need to prove their usefulness through labour to society. But it's not just the official media that presents these emotional stories. And I don't know whether you can see that. I don't know whether you see all this around the screen. I'm really sorry. But at the top, this newspaper is talking about something new in China called positive energy. And this newspaper report is talking about, it talks about positive energy. Disabled people don't complain. Just look at this guy who is disabled just like you. And it's telling the story of another person, Wu Yaohan, who very similar to Lu Hong has set up his own workplace to employ disabled persons as well. And it uses a lot of the same language as well, opening a window for disabled persons. But it's this positive energy, this zheng nang liang, that is really interested. And Derek Hurd, who's done a lot of research on this, has argued that zheng nang liang, positive energy, is very much linked to citizenship. These values of patriotism, dedication to work, honesty, friendliness, and things like happiness. So zheng nang liang can be directly linked to happiness. These form, he says, the emotional habitus where social and cultural capital are accumulated through the cultivation of emotional intelligence, EQ, EI, and emotional self-governance. Here, we can see, if we apply it to disability, that it helps to distinguish the ideal disabled citizens from the not-so-ideal ones. But as these emotions go that are associated with positive energy, happiness seems to be the one that comes out most. Happiness has been also associated with rights. Here we have a poster from International Day of the Disabled, and you can see from what is said underneath, give disabled people rights to ensure inclusion and equality. So we have the rights-based discourse. And may your loving care make happiness bloom. So non-disabled people helping disabled persons will make them happy. So it's good to be happy. This is an event that was held in Changsha. And it was like a big collective marriage, a joint, so lots of people getting married, or disabled persons getting married together. And here they could, by achieving that mark of marriage, encounter happiness. Even President Xi Jinping has got in on the act, and he is, sort of from the top man down, really. He suggests that if able-bodied people, Jian Chuanren, can live a dazzling, happy life, then disabled people should be able to do it too. So emotions are being mobilized in the various dimensions of China's part coercive, part cajoling citizenship practices. But not only that, we have this sense that it's a sense of feeling of gain. So happiness is part of this, the feeling that your life is moving towards a better place. And this is a wonderful little cartoon which sort of is explaining how China's social security system has been continuously improved. Disabled people are now enjoy social assistance, social welfare, social insurance benefits, and they've got this significant sense of gain. And this sort of includes a sense of well-being and also social development. And it's quite interesting that I think that these sort of sense of gain, the sense of happiness and security have all started to become development targets. And I think while it might seem like an important and obvious thing to do, there are clearly issues here because it sets up norms and expectations about what constitutes the happy Chinese citizen. And I take that term from Gerda Wielander, who's done lots of work on the concept of happiness. She argues that in its effort to retain control of China's feelings rules, the Chinese Communist Party continues to expect people to engage in emotional work to conform to the expected norm of a happy Chinese citizen. This is seen as a prerequisite to China's modernization and development. But, Wielander argues, once happiness becomes a development target decoupled from the collective project and recast as an ability that can be learned through emotion work, a happy frame of mind becomes a marker of sophistication and superior cultural quality. For disabled people and the troubled relationship with achieving typical markers of quality, but whatever marker you set, whether that's appearance, education, productivity, or by because of those many factors, most of which are extrinsic or external to them, the problem becomes all too clear. So, emotions, I would suggest, are woven into the very fabric of our lives. They shape, according to Martha Nussbaum, the landscape of our mental and social lives. We experience emotions, react to emotions, we change our behavior to them. They help us to motivate us, make decisions. They stimulate us to avoid uncomfortable situations, etc. They enable us to understand each other, react to each other. They are a critical element of our ability to engage in social communication. Emotions and the narratives that surround them are often seen as what part of what makes us human. If that is the case, what makes a human life valuable must be linked to both our emotional states as well as the emotional reactions to us of others. Indeed, there is increasing recognition, and this is part of my work, of the role emotions play not only in the way in which we feel we belong or not, but also in the ways others, and these may be human or non-human actors, make us feel like we belong or we don't. As such, they are fundamental to para-citizenship. Para-citizenship, I argue, is a process that's fraught with perils and possibilities. Emotions reveal the boundaries of what is acceptable and unacceptable. They provide the contours of what's desirable and what is undesirable. In doing so, they connect and disconnect bodies in a continual dance of identity and belonging. For those who have been touched who have not been touched by disability directly or indirectly, it is very difficult to imagine how it must feel to be disabled. We think we might know because of the signs and symbols that surround us, but we also have to remember that disabled people also live within those same systems of signs and symbols. This is why it's so very important that those human rights-based approaches I outlined at the start of the talk are so very important. Without equality, respect, and dignity, all of the positive energy and happiness work in the world is unlikely to change the fundamentally ableist hierarchies that characterize China's and many other societies around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dauncey. That was a lot to get us started and to start thinking. That was really excellent. And I don't want to. If Jess or Tiffany or Jessica want to jump in with some questions, I have a few that are specifically on the China side, but maybe also related. I'll just start with one, and that is this idea of paternalism and saviorism, if that's a word, but sort of this possibly the rigidity of that concept, and if there is, in your view, a kind of rigidity to the paternal state. I see that as a possible through line from the Confucian cosmos of the ruler as a kind of parent figure, and then the magistrate at the local level as a kind of parent figure, mother, father kind of figure, and the party also framing itself in that way as a sort of absolute solution to all things. Do you think that is a through line that can be sort of validly drawn, or has that been ruptured? It seems that in the rigidity of the one party state idea, there is a possible through line there in terms of the sort of institutional paternalism. Is that something that you see?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I think that paternalism, as you mentioned, has sort of stemmed from Confucian philosophy from the start. The fact that the ruler was supposed to be benevolent, ruler of the people, sort of the emperor was a benevolent ruler of the people, and that sort of extended throughout all sort of areas of administrative life and bureaucracy in imperial China. And although I think it was a much more sort of diffuse sense of paternalism, and I think the active parts of support and welfare for disabled people in sort of historical terms in China was very hit and miss. I don't think it was necessarily as unified as it's been presented in today's China, but so the various ways in which disabled people would be picked up by local magistrates, but also local religious institutions, that sense of sort of philanthropy from rich and benevolent individuals too. But I think that started sort of to change when missionaries and their sort of their concept of charity and pity came into China in the late 19th around in the 19th century really, and started to affect I suppose they sort of complemented each other in sort of all sorts of ways, but also reinforced the idea that disabled people were there to be looked after, and at the same time as that they had to be made useful too, because I think the missionaries and their sort of the ways in which they established schools for the blind, the deaf, and other physical impairments inherently focused on developing vocational skills that would make disabled persons useful. So I think that's when it sort of started to sort of change slightly, and it's obviously it's not neoliberal at that particular time, but this sense that there had to be a purpose and a value to a person's life, and they had to do something about it or be taught how to have the tools to do it. And that really developed across the 20th century, and I suppose as it met socialism and this sense that the state was the father, mother of the people, meeting also this sense of what made a productive citizen in terms of revolutionary purposes sort of was there. But I think you could see that thread running all the way through to today. And it's quite interesting. I think even though China is very neoliberal in lots of different ways, the paternalism of the state still hangs very strong, particularly when it comes to support and welfare for disabled people there.
Thank you very much. And Tiffany has a question in the classroom.
Yes, hi, Professor Dauncey. It's a huge pleasure. I'm sitting here with my History of Madness class students, and this just fits so wonderfully because we were just looking at 1970s and 80s psychiatric abuse in China and Soviet Union last class. But also we're starting to talk a lot about what we call mad activists next week. But I did, some questions kind of came out of your talk that's also kind of connected to my class. So if they're a little bit off, I apologize, on a different tangent. But I think it was fascinating that you talked a lot about this, the responsibilities, attached to para-citizenship. And that, there's this kind of subjectification that happens attached to emotions of disabled people, and that they are only valued through their contributions, whether it's labor, which I think is fascinating. There's a lot of what we've been discussing in class. But one of the questions that kind of emerged is how are those people who were deemed disabled in China being active, if at all, in trying to reinstitute their full citizenship? Are they buying into this whole concept of being happy and productive and, being these wonderfully, the ludicrous nature of often being happy all the time is very difficult. And what has been their response, if at all, and what happens when they're not? When they are not able to be the ideal, heroic, happy citizen that the state is trying to suggest that they should be.
Okay, thank you, Tim. That's a really great question, and I suppose one of the things I've been really interested in is particularly the ways in which people who are deemed to not have mental capacity are sort of fit into all of this. And historically, as you've probably already been talking about, institutionalization has been a way in which they've been removed. The problem has been sort of removed from society because they can't perform in the way that is expected of society. And that's not just China, as you say, it's the USSR. It could be, it's here in the UK too, and I'm sure in the US as well. So one of the solutions to problematic emotional subjects is that you remove them from the society, and that's how they've been dealt with historically. But if they're still within society and not somewhere else, as I don't know where this sort of sense that they have been not in society somehow, but if they're not sort of visible in society, then how, if they don't perform, or how do they respond to these emotional discourses is really interesting, because I work a lot with non-governmental organizations in China and a lot of young people as well. And I think we're probably seeing quite a generational response to these. And a lot of disabled persons of a certain age are they've grown up with these model citizens, and they know them, and that's part of their sort of emotional the backdrop to the way in which they sort of see themselves as fitting into society. Whereas the younger generation really are quite blasé about all of this, and they're quite like, oh yeah, whatever. So they're sort of, and so they say, well, we see these, they're not us, we don't care about them, we just want to get on, we want to live the good life, they say, we want to be happy, we want to have jobs, we want to have an education, we want to buy stuff, we want to have our own home, we want to get married, everything else that's sort of, those normal markers, that's what they're more interested in. They're not necessarily thinking of it directly as performing as a sort of an ideal para-citizen. What they're doing is they're living their lives. But I think my argument is that they're still framed and shaped unconsciously as well by these bigger discourses. And I sometimes I feel that they're often more targeted at non-disabled people to tell us how to think about disabled people. So if disabled people don't fulfill their roles appropriately, or sort of have the right emotions and the right performances, then it tells us how to feel about them. And I'm pretty sure in the US, in the same way we have the UK, we have these big debates about sort of scrounger mentalities and people who aren't pulling their weight, who are sort of scrounging off the welfare state. And in a way, I can see that's also happening in China too, is that people who don't contribute somehow productively are then, it makes it much easier for the state, the media, society to position them as useless people, as scroungers. Well, I've not seen that particular term or equivalent used in China, because obviously a lot of the press is really much more positive, and you don't tell the sort of the bad stories. That's the feeling that I get, is that these messages are often for non-disabled people to sort of buck them up and tell them how to live their lives, just as much as it's about telling them how to feel about disabled persons. So it's a sort of real complex sort of set of things there. But one of the things that we talk a lot about here in the UK is that there are some forms of impairment that are less complex for society to deal with than others. And of course, mental incapacity and mental impairment and sort of and psychosocial disabilities often feel to be towards the spectrum where society just struggles to deal with it. And one of a new piece of research that hopefully is coming out soon, I've been looking at, is the way in which mental incapacity is considered in China. And I think that's it's a real problem, really, because China sort of conflates mental health and mental incapacity. So, and then if you're looking at mental incapacity and mental health, how can anybody be happy about being ill? So whilst we can understand that somebody can have a lack of mental capacity, they can still be quite happy, but actually, how can you be happy about being ill? And so the conflation of health and incapacity is really problematic too. So I think there's a lot going on, and it's quite complicated. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer to your very short question.
No.
We do have two questions in the Q&A, but I also, if Jess and Jessica, if either of you have a question, please jump in. Otherwise, we also have King and Yawen both with a question.
I have,
Jess?
yeah, thank you so much. And Dr. Dauncey, thank you for your talk. I learned so much from it. I teach a bunch of classes centered around disability inclusion related topics because I'm on special assignment this year as the Disability Inclusion Fellow for our campus. And it's like the joy of my professional career. I've just been soaking it all in, and I'm so thankful to Dr. Murray for him organizing your visit with us today. And I'm a parent of a child with autism, and he is also a pediatric cancer survivor. So while I don't identify as a person living with disability myself, like I have the lived experience of being a parent advocate. And I saw in your book that we share this lived experience in common, and that your amazing child Orla has informed your work. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to share, um, and speak to how that lived experience informed things for you, right? Because I just see so much of the acknowledgement of that nuance, right? And about how these, I think of like the critical scholarship term of Nepantla, like things that don't go together, going together anyways. Right. Like, I believe I'm included while I'm actively being excluded. Right. And I've even seen that in grants that we apply for in the US, where it's like, what is your inclusive strategy? And we define inclusion as either actually including people or having people feel as if they're included, which really terrifies me to see things like that be institutionalized at those levels. And so I'm so fascinated by that idea of the para-citizenship, because there is so much of a nuance related to this topic, right? And so I'm just wondering, do you have any suggestions to avoid that conflict of feeling a different way than the institutional and societal realities surrounding people? Because that shouldn't be the goal, right? It shouldn't be the world should oppress people while they feel good about it. The goal should be something better than that, And so because I saw you get so much into the nuance, I was wondering if you have any suggestions about how we can do better and be better 50 years from now, 100 years from now, through your observations and study, especially because, also thank you, because I have students ask me every day, like, I wonder how the ADA, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, works in other countries. And it's like, well, it's the US law. It doesn't, and so this really is a global conversation. And I think it's worthy of thinking about ways that we can have global ideas and global solutions, especially in a country that hasn't even ratified the UN Convention on the Disabled Rights, UNCDPR, Convention on Disabled. I'm saying it wrong, but I know the acronym.
UNCRPD, yeah.
Thank you. Yes. But yeah, what suggestions do you have for us? How can we be better 100 years from now in all of the ways that I just kind of highlighted?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, and I think that's what I'm really trying to capture. And one of the things I'm going to be doing over the next 3 years is really trying to drill down into all of the areas of citizenship and seeing how emotions and belonging and inclusion work in China. So I've got the blessed relief of 3 years to exclusively work on this. So I'm going to be taking away what you've just said and hopefully coming back with some answers. But I think it is that tension, isn't it? Is that all of these processes and laws and legislation, they're often designed to make us feel like we belong, but actually, when it comes to the sort of enactment of them and the real life sort of reality of them, that they don't, which is part of the structural problems of society, isn't it? And I think how I sort of starting with China, really, I think what I see is that the voices of disabled persons, although they've become much more prominent in recent years, really play very little part in the design of legislation and the implementation of it. So in contrast to, and I know you're probably going to say, well, actually, we have our problems here in America, and we certainly do in the UK. And I suppose in contrast to the ADA and the Equality Act, which was based on sort of protection, a law sort of relating specifically to disabled persons here in the UK. Those were designed by disabled persons. It was their voices that were there, and part of the problem is it's the implementation of all these things. Whereas in China, the implementation, the voices that weren't even there to start with. So it's very much a non-disabled vision of what inclusion and emotions around inclusion are like. So I think there are certain levels, and there are certain states which are working towards what we might see as that most inclusive vision of the UNCRPD, although there are criticisms of that also. How we do it sort of in a day-to-day life, I think is really quite difficult. But so one of the things I was thinking about earlier today was thinking about these ideas of in a postmodern sense, sort of if we're thinking about people like Zygmunt Bauman and his ideas of sort of postmodernity, really we should be celebrating heterogeneity and difference and diversity and plurality in all its various forms. And I don't think we've got there yet. And I think that's the big stumbling point. I think impairment is still seen as different. And all of this legislation, as soon as you sort of attach disability to it, or, it sort of targets the difference. And I think one of the things we've done in the UK is by having the Equalities Act, which looks at all forms of protected characteristics. And again, it's not perfect, and please don't think it is, but I think it's one of those different states are taking different routes to try to sort of both protect but also respect. And there's a tension between highlighting difference in order to protect it, but also then trying to say that, we're all human. And I mentioned Dan Goodley and his work in the talk earlier, and I think there's a sort of a strong sense of sort of the post-human, or the sort of the sense that there's something more about being human than there is about these categorizations of putting people into boxes and then dealing with them, which is I think is really what you were saying, Jess, is that we often have to identify the difference in order to deal with it, and by identifying the difference, you draw attention to the difference, and that's really the trouble, isn't it? I think, and I think. Going back to your original point about my daughter being the inspiration for this particular book anyway, and the original research that I did is the fact that we're constantly having to draw attention to the otherness of disability in order to get the respect and the protection that people deserve. And I'm wondering how can we move beyond that point, whereas humans are inherently seen as diverse and equally deserving of respect, regardless of their physical or mental capacities and appearances. And I think we're going to, you say 50 to 100 years, I think it may that, although I think there have been some great leap forwards, but I think disabled voices are the way forward. I think we have to ensure that disabled persons' voices, experiences are front and center of anything that happens going forward, or else the task is lost, should we say.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jess. And I want to refer quickly to the questions in the Q&A from King and from Yawen here. And then in I would say in 5 minutes max, I'd also like to let Professor Dauncey go and have her Friday evening meal. It's a funny time that we've asked her to join us, so I don't want to keep you too much beyond the bottom of the hour. King asks, can you address if there's maybe if it's okay, Sarah, I'll bundle these questions. Is that okay?
Okay. Yep. I'm afraid I can't see them in the chat.
Okay. They're in the Q&A, which you might have
Q&A.
access to.
Sorry, looking in the wrong place. Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
King asks, can you address if there's also a state promotion of social accommodations like we do in the US? And you talked a little bit about this already in a sense. Propaganda campaigns you showed illustrate the ways the state is promoting some sort of emotional accommodations demanded on the public. And then Yawen has 2 questions. The first is brief. Has the welfare for disabled people experienced any significant changes after Xi Jinping's building the Chinese dream efforts? And then the second question from Yawen, one intriguing observation I have is the increasing awareness of the derogatory connotations associated with terms traditionally used to describe individuals such as crippled or blind. Do you view this as the beginning of a broader awakening among the new and educated generation, or perhaps as a sign of China aligning its attitudes with those of other Western countries? And King To-young is in our sociology department, and Yawen Lee is in our social work department here at Cal State. So thanks both for joining, and I'll turn it over to Sarah for those questions. And maybe if you want to move toward wrapping up, we can do that too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so quickly, I think that's really interesting. I'm going to start with Yawen's first because there's a changing, I suppose what I have seen, and I also track this in the book, is a change in sort of terminology that's been used across the 20th century into the 21st century. I think what I wouldn't say necessarily that China is aligning its attitudes with those of other Western countries. I think what it's more is doing is engaging with Sinophone sphere development. So working with, for example, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other sort of areas which are more culturally have a cultural affinities there. And I think that's where a lot of the activist learning are coming into China and then being sort of promoted out. But it's quite interesting. There's a study that I know of, and I don't think it's been published yet, but one of the findings of the study is that whilst Chinese activists are starting to use terms such as tanzhanren, which is sort of building on a term for disabled persons that's it's sort of inherently sort of builds in the social model of disability and obstacles and sort of barriers, which have come I think from came originally from Taiwan, and it's also used in Hong Kong, but it's that those sort of terms aren't really recognised as much sort of among the broader population, although they're very very activist driven terms, and it's quite interesting that parents of children they're sort of trying to grapple with these terms themselves. So, and they're saying, well, that's not us. That doesn't describe us. It doesn't mean anything to us. It sounds a bit poncy and academic. And they prefer the term tangi, which is a little bit old hat now. Really, the tangi is disabled in terms of impaired and sick person. So I can see there's changes in vocabulary coming, but I wouldn't say and those terms, crippled, blind, those I think they are changing with broader awareness, but I don't think it's coming necessarily from the West. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Has welfare changed? Yes, I think it has. I think there's been a vast amount of increased support for disabled persons in China. I think that really, but I don't necessarily know whether it's a direct part of sort of the recent campaigns. I think a lot more attention has been paid to the eradication of poverty in China, and I think by extension, disabled persons have ended up benefiting from those poverty eradication policies. So it's quite a complex picture to sort of pick up on there, but I certainly think welfare has ramped up since sort of the early 2010s onwards. And going back very quickly to King's question, social accommodations like we do in the King, just what do you mean by social accommodations? Do you mind if I ask that question? I'm just wondering if it's the same sense of social accommodations that we would use here in the UK.
I can invite King to type another note, please, in the Q&A, King, if you wanted to follow up on what you mean by social accommodations. And Finn, if you're able to promote King to a panelist, he could also join us here.
Who's the one?
King To-young.
I just did.
All right, King, if you're available, if you're in a space where you can chat, you should be able to join us as a panelist and unmute and elaborate a little bit on that. Sorry, not to put you right on the spot. And if you're not in a quiet space, you can also type a couple notes into the Q&A.
Well, I mean, whilst you're doing that, I'm reading it as social accommodations, as in adaptations that for disabled persons that enable them to live and engage in social life. I'm assuming like that. So in the same way we might have educational accommodations to enable disabled persons to engage in to access education. I understand that, but the state is, yeah, in a sense. Absolutely. I think there are ways in which, so I suppose, more barrier-free and inclusive environments are being promoted in China today. I think there are still, if we're talking about, for example, education, there are still great difficulties in accessing inclusive education in China. And I think one of the special education is still a mainstream, is still the mainstay of, or the backbone of education for persons with disabilities in China. So, but I don't think accommodation is necessarily the way in which China is going. So it's more about a lot of barrier-free legislation that's gone through recently, and a lot of it is about architectural access, use of Braille, things like that, but not necessarily thinking about things in a sort of very joined up way, or in a way in which we're sort of a more holistic way. So it's sort of very sort of regimented and specific to certain areas of life. Emotional accommodations demanded on the public. Yeah, it's. I'm not sure about. I'm just trying to think how to answer this. I suppose the emotional accommodations demanded on the public. I'm just wondering from King, who's demanding what of whom? I'm sorry, I'm slightly struggling with this question. Apologies. Is King there?
He's not. He might not be in a place where he can follow up.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I've failed miserably to answer that question.
I think you got us thinking about it. No, I think this is a rich discussion and a long discussion, and this has been a really, really wonderful start to it. And I do want to recommend everybody pick up Professor Dauncey's book, which I shared in the chat. I've just begun it here myself, and I know my fellow organizers have a copy here. So we're looking forward to really enjoying the text and getting a much deeper dive into this subject that you've just really started us thinking about. I think in ways that build on the book also in these new directions. So you've given us a lot to think about in a really, really rich session. And if you have any closing thoughts, I'll turn it back over to you, Professor Dauncey. But thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for making me spend my Friday evening with you. It's been wonderful. Thank you for the invitation, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to following your work, Professor Dauncey. Thanks everybody for joining.
Bye.